They mocked my humble life until I bought every investment their parents owned. My name is Adrian Cole. For a long time, that name meant absolutely nothing in the city I lived in. No recognition, no influence. And to be honest, I preferred it that way. Before we dive deeper, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. We will be excited to have you join our growing family of enthusiasts who enjoy the wonderful stories told on this channel. I came from a humble background, not the kind people like to turn into motivational speeches, not the kind that makes headlines or earns sympathy. Mine was the quiet kind, the kind people don't ask about because the answers make them uncomfortable. I grew up learning the value of restraint, of patience, of making do without complaining. I learned early that money doesn't just buy comfort, it buys voice. And when you don't have it, people ignore you. I learned to stay quiet. Not because I was weak, but because silence teaches you more than noise ever will. That habit followed me into adulthood, into my education, into my career. And it followed me straight into the glass doors of Redmont Holdings as a financial controller, a job I valued and was ready to give my best. On paper, Redmont was impressive. A respected firm, a long history, a powerful name in the city. Redmont Holdings was run by 3 joint owners, men who had once been admired in the city. They were old friends, bound together by years of shared risk, long nights, and early sacrifices. People spoke of them with respect, sometimes even envy. They had built the company decades earlier, brick by brick, contract by contract, mistake by mistake. But by the time I arrived, the hands that once held the company steady were no longer the ones steering it. The real power had shifted. Quietly, casually, almost carelessly. Each of the owners had placed their children into top management positions, not after rigorous preparation or years of training, but as if leadership were an heirloom, something passed down simply because it existed. They called it succession planning. They said it was about continuity, about preserving legacy, about keeping the company in the family. But from where I stood, it was something else entirely. It was entitlement, wrapped in expensive suits and protected by last names. There were 3 of them. And from my very first week, it became clear that Redmont was no longer run by experience or discipline, but by appearance, status, and unchecked confidence. The most visible of the 3 was Vanessa Grant. You didn't need to ask who she was. The room always told you. Vanessa entered every space like she owned it, not just the office, but the city itself. She spoke loudly, laughed freely, and never missed an opportunity to remind people of her lifestyle. Designer bags rested casually on conference tables. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from boutiques, travel agents, and people who wanted to be seen near her. Everyone in the city knew Vanessa. She was photographed at exclusive events, mentioned in social circles, whispered about in restaurants. Her name carried weight, not because of what she did, but because of how she lived. And Redmont Holdings, to her, was less a responsibility and more a funding source. She spent money the way some people breathed, without thought, without restraint, without consequence. Company cards were swiped for personal indulgences. Business trips were extended into luxury vacations. Expenses were approved with a smile and a shrug. Whenever someone raised a concern, she waved it away. Relax, she'd say. This company can afford it. That sentence alone told me everything. Then there were the 2 sons, Lucas Reed and Ethan Moore. They were rarely apart. If one was present, the other wasn't far behind. They shared the same taste in clothes, the same taste in travel, the same taste in excess. Their lives were a continuous highlight reel: airports, resorts, nightclubs, private lounges. They spoke in confidence, but never in detail. In meetings, they leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, voices relaxed, tossing around big words they didn't fully understand. They nodded through presentations they hadn't read, approved decisions they hadn't analyzed, deferred responsibility whenever consequences appeared. They wore expensive suits, always tailored, always crisp. Watches that cost more than some people's annual salaries rested casually on their wrists. From a distance, they looked like leaders. Up close, they were tourists in positions of authority. They loved to talk about vision, about growth, about expansion. But when it came to execution, structure, or discipline, they were absent. The company's problems weren't invisible. They were simply ignored. And then there was me. No family name hanging above my head. No inheritance waiting in the wings. No safety net disguised as confidence. I didn't arrive with noise. I didn't arrive with entitlement. I didn't arrive expecting anything to be handed to me. I arrived quietly. I observed more than I spoke. Listened more than I argued. Worked more than I advertised. In a company built on inheritance, I was the outsider. The anomaly. The reminder that some people earn their place rather than inherit it. And from the way they looked at me, from the first glance, the first smirk, the first dismissive comment, I knew something immediately. I did not belong to their world. But what they never considered was that their world was already collapsing. They just hadn't felt it yet. The first thing I learned at Redmont Holdings was this. Silence made people uncomfortable, especially people who mistook noise for authority. My first major exposure to the inner workings of the company came during a Monday morning executive meeting. It was held in the top-floor boardroom, glass walls, polished wood, city skylines stretching endlessly behind us. The kind of room designed to impress investors and intimidate anyone who didn't belong. I arrived early because I believed preparation was a form of respect. Respect for the role, for the company, and for myself. I sat near the end of the table, my notebook open, pen aligned neatly across the page. Around me, the room slowly filled with managers, assistants, and department heads. Then they arrived. Vanessa Grant came in first, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her conversation loud enough for half the room to hear. "No, tell him I don't do economy," she said, rolling her eyes. "If it's not first class, I'm not going." She hung up and dropped into her chair without acknowledging anyone. Moments later, Lucas and Ethan walked in together. "I told you the club was overrated," Ethan said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Doesn't matter," Lucas replied. "We were on the yacht after anyway." They took their seats near the head of the table, positions they had never earned, only inherited. The meeting began. Reports were presented, numbers appeared on the screen, graphs dipped and rose. Revenue was flattening, costs were increasing. As each issue came up, I watched the three of them. Vanessa scrolled through her phone. Lucas nodded absently, as if understanding was optional. When the floor was finally opened for input, something in me stirred. I hesitated. Not because I lacked confidence in my analysis, but because I understood the room. I knew how people reacted when someone like me spoke out of turn. Still, the numbers didn't lie. So I cleared my throat. "I think there's a structural issue in our operational spending," I said calmly. "Several units are operating without cost controls. If we restructured procurement and centralized approval." Vanessa looked up from her phone. Slowly, as if she had just noticed a piece of furniture speaking. She stared at me for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. "Who is this?" she asked, turning to Lucas. Lucas squinted in my direction. "Oh, that's the new guy." Ethan smirked, "The frugal one." The room went quiet. Not the respectful kind of quiet, but the uncomfortable watch what happens next kind. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. Her eyes traveled over me, my simple suit, my modest tie, my worn but polished shoes. "You're suggesting we change how we run the company?" she asked. "Yes," I replied evenly. "If we don't, we'll continue bleeding capital." She laughed again, louder this time. That's adorable, she said. You've been here, what, a few weeks? 3, I answered. And you think you understand Redmont better than people who grew up in it? I didn't respond immediately. Lucas leaned forward. Look, Adrian, right? He said. We appreciate enthusiasm, really, but this company isn't run on spreadsheets alone. Ethan chimed in. Yeah, there's image, presence, confidence. Vanessa smirked. And lifestyle. A few people laughed nervously. I'm only pointing out the data, I said quietly. The numbers suggest. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. Relax, she said. This isn't accounting school. Go back to your desk and do what you're paid for. The meeting moved on. Just like that. But something had changed. From that day forward, I wasn't just the quiet guy in the room. I was the joke. They mocked my lunch when I ate simple meals in the break room. Is that homemade? Lucas asked one afternoon, laughing. Wow, didn't know people still did that. Vanessa once looked me up and down and said, You know, if you spent less time saving money, you might actually look like you belong here. They joked about my old car, clothes, and silence. What they didn't joke about was the work. Because I never stopped. I stayed late. Reviewed reports others ignored. Noted patterns no one cared to see. I didn't argue anymore. I documented. And while they laughed, I learned. The humiliation stopped being incidental. It became deliberate. It started small. So small that anyone watching from the outside would have dismissed it as harmless office banter. But there is a difference between joking with someone and joking at them. And I was never laughing. One afternoon, the entire management team gathered for a quarterly strategy session. It was less of a strategy meeting and more of a performance. Vanessa had turned it into a showcase. Slides filled with glossy visuals, expensive branding concepts, and ambitious expansion plans that weren't backed by a single realistic projection. As she spoke, I reviewed the numbers quietly on my tablet. They didn't add up. Not even close. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Vanessa smiled like a queen accepting praise. Then she looked at me. Adrian, she said sweetly, you've been very quiet today. I felt the room turn toward me. Do you have something analytical to add? She asked, emphasizing the word like it was an insult. I hesitated because I knew exactly what would follow. Yes, I said calmly. The projected expansion costs exceed our current liquidity. If we proceed without restructuring debt, we risk. Lucas cut me off. Risk, he laughed. This company was taking risks before you learned how to tie a tie. A few people chuckled. Vanessa tilted her head. You always sound so serious, she said. Laughter. I've said what I needed to say, I replied quietly. Vanessa smiled. Good, because we're done talking about numbers. The meeting ended, but the humiliation followed me out. In the hallway, Lucas walked past me and said just loud enough for others to hear. Hey, Adrian, you should write a book, How to Save Pennies and Lose Opportunities. Another time in the elevator, Vanessa glanced at my shoes and said, You know, appearances matter. This is a luxury company, not a charity. I nodded, because I was learning something important. They weren't just incompetent. They were reckless. And reckless people always leave trails. Weeks passed, then months. The jokes got sharper. During a company dinner at an upscale restaurant, one I would never have chosen myself, Vanessa loudly announced, Don't worry, Adrian, order whatever you want. This one's on the company. She winked, as if she were doing me a favor. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely. Inside, something hardened. Not anger. Resolve. That night, when I returned home to my modest apartment, I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. Every decision. Every ignored warning, every inflated expense, every personal withdrawal disguised as business costs. I was preparing for reality, because I could see it clearly now. Redmont Holdings wasn't being run. It was being consumed. And people like Vanessa, Lucas, and Ethan never notice the fire. Until the smoke starts choking them. The final straw came during a performance review. Vanessa sat across from me, flipping through my file like it bored her. "Your work ethic is impressive," she admitted, "but you don't really fit the culture here." "Which part?" I asked. She smiled thinly. "The ambition part." I met her eyes. "I'm ambitious," I said. "I just don't advertise it." She laughed. "Well, that's your problem." That night, as I left the building long after everyone else had gone home, I stood in the lobby and looked back at the glowing offices above. For the first time since I joined Redmont Holdings, I asked myself a dangerous question. What if this place was never meant to be saved? And once that question was asked, I already knew the answer. I didn't leave Redmont Holdings with a dramatic resignation. There was no confrontation, no slammed doors, no final speech where I told them how wrong they were. That would have been too loud. And loud exits are remembered. I chose silence. The decision came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The kind of evening that looks harmless until it quietly changes the direction of your life. I was still at my desk long after most people had gone home. The office lights above the executive wing were dark. Vanessa, Lucas, and Ethan had flown out earlier that afternoon for a business retreat in Monaco. That's what the calendar said anyway. The photos they posted later suggested something closer to a luxury vacation. I was reviewing the company's cash flow statements when the final piece fell into place. It wasn't just mismanagement anymore. It was collapse. Redmont was bleeding money through inflated contracts, vanity projects, and reckless borrowing. Short-term loans were being rolled over repeatedly. Vendor payments were delayed. A few key partners had quietly begun pulling out. And worst of all, the owners, their parents, had no idea how bad it was. Or maybe they didn't want to know. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I had done everything I could. I had warned them. I had proposed restructuring. I had offered conservative growth plans. Each time I was laughed at, mocked, dismissed as small-minded. 5 days later, I drafted my resignation letter. It was short, professional, gracious. I appreciate the opportunity to have worked with Redmont Holdings. I believe my values and long-term vision no longer align with the company's direction. That was all. No accusations. No bitterness. Just truth wrapped in politeness. The next morning, I handed the letter to Human Resources. The HR manager looked up at me in surprise. "You're leaving?" "Yes," I replied. "Do you have another offer?" "I do." That wasn't entirely true yet. But it would be. Word traveled fast. By midday, Vanessa summoned me to her office. She was seated behind her desk, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up when I entered. "So," she said casually, "I hear you're quitting." "Yes." She finally glanced up, one perfectly groomed eyebrow raised. "And where exactly do you think you're going?" "Somewhere my work matters," I said calmly. She laughed. "You're making a mistake." "Am I?" She leaned back in her chair. "People like you need companies like this. Structure, stability. You don't exactly strike me as entrepreneurial." I nodded, "Maybe not." She waved her hand dismissively. "Well, good luck, Adrian." That was the last thing she ever said to me. On my final day, Lucas slapped me on the back near the elevator. "Hey, no hard feelings," he said. "Just don't forget us when you're wherever you're going." Ethan added with a grin, Yeah, send us a postcard from your next budget apartment. I smiled. I will, I said. And then I left. No one walked me out. No farewell email was sent. No one noticed the absence of the man who had quietly kept their numbers from falling apart sooner. That was fine. I didn't need them to notice. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that I wasn't stepping down. I was stepping sideways, and then forward. Within weeks, I joined a mid-sized investment and restructuring firm on the other side of the city. The role wasn't glamorous, no flashy title, no executive perks. But the people there listened. They valued data. They respected discipline. They understood patience. For the first time, I wasn't being mocked for my frugality. I was being trusted because of it. I worked harder than I ever had. Late nights, early mornings, endless analysis. I helped turn around failing divisions. I advised on distressed acquisitions. I learned how companies truly collapse and how they could be rebuilt piece by piece. Years passed. Quietly. Meanwhile, Redmont Holdings stayed in the news. At first, it was praise, expansion announcements, luxury partnerships, high-profile events. Then the tone changed. Delayed projects, leadership reshuffles, unexplained losses. Rumors began circulating. I watched from a distance. By the time Redmont's creditors started circling, I was no longer just an employee. I was a partner. And when a group of investors approached me with an idea, a consortium focused on acquiring undervalued, mismanaged companies, I didn't hesitate. We called it Aurelius Capital Trust, and I was chosen to lead it. Because I understood something most people didn't. You don't destroy empires with force. You let them destroy themselves. And then you buy what's left. Redmont Holdings was at the top of our list. And soon, very soon, the people who laughed when I worked in silence were about to learn just how expensive laughter can be. There's a moment in every collapsing empire when denial becomes impossible. For Redmont Holdings, that moment arrived quietly, hidden in a routine financial disclosure that no one bothered to read until it was too late. I read it the morning it was released. I was seated in a glass-walled conference room at Aurelius Capital Trust, the city unfolding beneath us through the windows. Around the table sat analysts, legal advisors, and two senior partners. They were discussing several potential acquisitions, but my attention was fixed on one name. Redmont Holdings. I closed the report and looked up. It's worse than we thought, I said. One of the partners, Frank Hale, leaned forward. How bad? They're insolvent in everything but name, I replied. Short-term obligations exceed liquid assets. Vendor trust is gone. Their debt structure is unstable. If one major creditor pulls out, it's over. The room went quiet. Not shocked. Focused. This was the moment Aurelius had been built for. What about leadership? Frank asked. I paused. The children are still running operations, I said. The parents remain majority shareholders, but they're distant, comfortable. They believe the brand will carry itself. Someone exhaled softly. It won't. No, I said, it won't. Across the city, chaos was brewing. Vanessa Grant noticed it first, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't the numbers that alarmed her. It was the silence. The calls that stopped coming back. The invitations that dried up. The vendors who suddenly insisted on upfront payments. She stormed into a board meeting one afternoon, designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Why are people acting like we're desperate? She demanded. We're Redmont. Lucas shrugged. Markets fluctuate. Ethan laughed it off. Relax, this will pass. But it didn't. Within weeks, banks began tightening terms. A long-standing credit line was reduced without explanation. Another was frozen entirely. For the first time, the parents, old men who had built their wealth on instinct and relationships, asked for a full financial briefing. They didn't like what they saw. Not one bit. "What do you mean we're over-leveraged?" one of them snapped. Vanessa tried to smooth things over. "It's just temporary. We invested heavily in growth." "Growth without returns," her father shot back. "That's not growth, that's gambling." The word hung in the air. Gambling. And suddenly, everyone understood. The city began to whisper. Redmont Holdings was in trouble. At Aurelius, we moved carefully. No rush. Just quiet conversations with creditors, suppliers, and minority stakeholders. We positioned ourselves. I attended meetings where Redmont's name came up again and again. Every time I spoke calmly, objectively, as if the company was just another asset. Then came the call. One of Redmont's primary lenders wanted to sell their exposure. "Vast. They're afraid," Frank said after hanging up. "If they don't exit now, they'll be dragged down with it." I nodded, "We'll take it." That single move changed everything. Once one creditor pulled back, others followed. Confidence evaporated. Redmont's stock value, once propped up by reputation, plummeted. The parents panicked. Emergency meetings were called. Consultants were hired. And finally, too late, they asked a question that should have been asked years earlier. Who has been handling our internal controls? The answer led them to old reports. Old warnings. Old emails. My emails. Suddenly, my name resurfaced. Adrian Cole, one of them muttered. Wasn't he the analyst who kept raising concerns? Yes, Vanessa said quietly. He left. Why? She didn't answer. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting something else. That they had mocked the only person who saw the cliff before they reached it. By the time Redmont publicly announced it was seeking strategic alternatives, Aurelius Capital Trust was already 3 steps ahead. We didn't want to rescue the company. We wanted to own it. And as the weeks passed, the noose tightened. Redmont's assets were being evaluated. Its subsidiaries scrutinized. Its reputation stripped down to raw numbers. And every number pointed to the same conclusion. The company was about to fall. All it needed was someone to step in and buy the wreckage. And when that day came, I would be the one sitting at the head of the table. Listening, watching, waiting. The acquisition didn't happen with fireworks. It happened the way all real power moves do, quietly, formally, and without emotion. Redmont Holdings announced a special board meeting on a gray Monday morning. No press, no celebration, just a mandatory attendance notice sent to executives, shareholders, and legal representatives. By then, everyone knew what it meant. The company was finished as it had been. Inside the executive boardroom, tension sat heavier than the polished oak table. Vanessa Grant arrived early for once. She wore a tailored suit, elegant but restrained, very different from the flamboyant confidence she used to display. Lucas and Ethan followed shortly after, unusually quiet, their jokes long gone. Their parents sat at the far end of the table. Older, tired, angry in the way only regret can make a person angry. The lead legal advisor cleared his throat. Thank you for coming. As you all know, Redmont Holdings has been in discussions regarding a full acquisition. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her pen. After reviewing all proposals, the advisor continued, the board has unanimously agreed to accept the offer from Aurelius Capital Trust. The room exhaled. Some relief. Some shame. What are the terms? One of the fathers asked. Full acquisition of Redmont Holdings and its subsidiaries, the advisor replied. Operational control transfers immediately, Existing executive roles will be reviewed. Vanessa swallowed. And who exactly is leading Aurelius Capital Trust? The advisor paused, then smiled politely. The president and managing director is Mr. Adrian Cole. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that drains color from a room. Vanessa's face went pale. Lucas stared at the table as if it had betrayed him. Ethan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's not funny. It's not a joke, the advisor said calmly. One of the fathers frowned. Adrian Cole. Yes. The memories hit them all at once. The quiet man in the plain suits. The one who ate modest lunches. The one they interrupted in meetings. The one they laughed at. Vanessa felt her chest tighten. No, she whispered, that's not possible. But it was. Moments later, the doors opened. And I walked in. No announcement. No dramatic pause. Just steady footsteps across the floor I once cleaned metaphorically with my patience. Every head turned. Some froze. Some lowered their eyes. Vanessa couldn't move at all. I stopped at the head of the table and nodded politely. Good morning, I said. Thank you for waiting. The legal advisor gestured toward me. Mr. Cole, the board has accepted the offer. I took my seat. Excellent, I replied. Let's proceed. Vanessa finally found her voice. Adrian, she said, barely audible. You never said. I replied calmly, not looking at her. We're here to discuss the transition. Lucas leaned forward, his confidence shattered. So this was all planned. I met his eyes for the first time. No, I said, your collapse wasn't planned, it was predictable. That hurt more than anger ever could. I turned to their parents. You built something meaningful once, I said evenly. But you stopped protecting it. You handed it to people who confused spending with leadership. No one argued. They couldn't. I won't dismantle Redmont, I continued, but it will never be run the same way again. Vanessa's voice trembled. What happens to us? I paused. This was the moment they feared. The moment they expected revenge. You'll be treated fairly, I said, based on performance, not inheritance. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. Not because she lost luxury, but because she finally understood what she had lost years ago, respect for someone who never asked for it. After the meeting, she tried to speak to me privately. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't know if I had known. I looked at her then. Knowing wouldn't have changed who you were, I said gently, and I didn't succeed so you could apologize. She nodded, broken. In the weeks that followed, Aurelius Capital Trust completed not just the acquisition of Redmont Holdings, but several other assets quietly owned by the same families. Their empire didn't collapse overnight. It dissolved, controlled, illegal, final. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I returned to work. Because the lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about silence. My name is Adrian Cole. And this was the price of underestimating silence. If you found this story interesting, please remember to like the video and hit the subscribe button. Also turn on the notifications so you don't miss out on any of our amazing videos. And lastly, endeavor to share the video with your friends. Thank you and see you in the next video.